I grow a lot of beans, usually focusing on producing fresh tender pods, mostly from climbing bean plants growing in the polytunnel. I've also been exploring growing different types of beans for harvesting as semi-mature seeds, especially with the broad beans or fava beans, which I usually harvest at a stage where the seeds are quite large but still green and tender. But it is producing a dried seed that I'm perhaps more interested in these days, to produce lots of storable vegetable protein that we can use to supplement all of the fresh vegetables that we can grow. Getting any beans to mature and dry adequately can be a challenge here in rainy Ireland, so this year I tried growing a large batch of broad beans in one of the polytunnels. This was mainly for seed saving, but I also wanted to see how productive these plants could be in a more protected microclimate, to see if this was a viable way of producing lots of dried beans for the kitchen. The more common types of French, climbing, or runner beans for producing either fresh pods or seeds are not frost tolerant, and our frost-free growing season can be quite short. But it is the cool temperatures and windy conditions that we usually have in the summer that can prevent these warmer season crops from doing well in my gardens. And we generally get a lot of rainy weather in August and September, which reduces the chance of getting a good crop of dried beans from the outside gardens. Broad beans or fava beans are quite different than these more common types of beans, especially because they can grow in cool conditions and can tolerate quite hard frost, which would kill off most other types of bean plants. This makes them much more suitable for growing outside in the cool climate of Ireland, and there are some varieties that can be sown in the autumn to grow over winter in a relatively sheltered spot or with some protection. So broad or fava bean plants are probably a more appropriate option if I want to try to produce lots of dried bean seeds here in Ireland. The pods of this type of bean are edible when very young, but these plants are usually grown for semi-mature seeds. And as with all bean and pea plants, it is possible to leave a few of the pods on the plants to allow them to mature and dry, either for seed saving or for use in the kitchen. But this isn't always successful, especially if we get a really wet August like we had this year, which increases the chance that the seeds will simply rot rather than dry. It also keeps the plants in the ground for longer, reducing the opportunity of getting another crop into the same space in time to produce later in the year. I generally prefer to save seeds from separate plants growing in a different area, rather than saving seeds from a few plants in the main gardens, mainly to avoid adding another complication or variable into the trials and explorations that I'm doing. And I feel there are significant benefits to growing dedicated plants for seed saving in a polytunnel, at least here in Ireland, as the drier and more controllable conditions can lead to a better crop of higher quality seeds. But this does introduce other issues, such as pest pressure and the plants growing really big in the warmer and less windy microclimate. This year I dedicated one bed of the older polytunnel to seed saving, exploring saving seeds from a range of different crops, including a 4-meter length of the bed dedicated to broad beans. I direct sowed the broad bean crop at the end of last year, using seeds of the Masterpiece Green Long Pod variety, which I've been growing for a few years. I randomly selected this variety a while ago, and I don't really have much experience with other varieties, so I can't really recommend it, but hopefully I will be doing a proper variety trial of broad beans next year. With the cool soil temperatures at that time of year, I was not sure about the germination of the older seeds. I could have sown them in pots in a warmer environment and transplanted them later, but I decided to soak and pre-sprout the seeds instead. I planted only the viable seeds once the root tip broke through the seed shell, discarding any seeds that were too slow to germinate. This method worked as there was full germination, with only a few plants being slower than the others. I ended up with 38 plants in a double row down a 4-meter long bed, which should provide decent genetic diversity for seed saving, and I was also hoping it would produce an abundance of dried seeds for use in the kitchen. The plants grew quickly and started flowering at the beginning of April, when there were very few pollinators around. Apparently, insects are not necessary for pollinating the flowers of a broad bean plant, as each flower contains both male and female parts, but I have heard that insects can help to trigger the pollination within the flower. I have noticed in the past that not all broad bean flowers will produce a pod, and I was wondering if a lack of pollination could be part of the issue. So I decided to try to help the pollination process by opening the flowers, similar to the way a bumblebee would push the petals apart to get access to the nectar inside the flower. I did this type of hand pollination to only one of the 2 rows of plants, repeating the process several times to try to get as many flowers as I could. But I don't think it made much of a difference, or the method I used wasn't appropriate or adequate, as there seemed to be as many pods developing on both rows, though I didn't do a proper count or comparison. It is possible that some pollinating insects had been in the polytunnel that I didn't notice, but it seems that the tendency for some broadbean flowers to not produce a pod is not necessarily due to a lack of pollination. I suspect that it is related more to the capacity of a plant to only be able to develop so many pods, probably depending on its growing conditions, available space, and perhaps fertility levels in the soil. This is something that I would like to explore some more, to see if other factors could help plants produce more pods and more seeds. These plants grew really tall in the shelter of the polytunnel, and I decided to pinch off the growing tip of all of the plants in one row. This was also the row that I had hand-pollinated the flowers of, so I was mixing explorations, which generally isn't a good idea. Removing the growing tip of these plants is supposed to encourage the plant to focus on developing the existing pods to get faster seed development rather than additional growth. These growing tips of the broadbean plants are edible, and we enjoyed eating them battered and fried as a type of tempura or fritter. Removing these tips also reduces the potential impact of black fly and aphids, which can heavily colonize the tender grow tips of these plants, draining the plant of energy and nutrients. I didn't have any issues with these pests on the plants that I had left growing in the polytunnel, but there was quite a lot of them on the outside plants. There was some rotting stems on the seed-saving plants in the polytunnel, and some issues with the leaves, but overall the plants were fine. The biggest problem was the height that the plants grew to, especially the row that I didn't remove the growing tips from. These plants became very top-heavy, and with the lack of wind in the polytunnel to strengthen the stems, these plants started to fall over. I tried to construct a support frame to keep the plants from falling over too much, but the structure was too late and inadequate. The taller plants fell over, mixing with the other row and creating a tangled mess, which made it a lot harder to see if there was any difference in the production of pods in between the two rows. Because of the earlier sowing and the warmer conditions in the polytunnel, the pods and the seeds were dried and ready to collect before the broadbean plants outside had even started to produce green seeds large enough to harvest. If these plants had not been such a tangled mess with twine and canes mixed in, I could have cut all the plants off at the soil and placed them on a tarp in a ventilated covered space to fully dry. And then it would be fairly easy to flail or step on all of the plants or even drive over them with a vehicle in order to dislodge the seeds from the pods. But I decided to handpick all of the pods and took the opportunity to count them in the process, because that's the kind of crazy thing that I do. For those who are interested in numbers, I collected about 930 pods from the 38 plants, so an average of about 24 pods from each plant, but not all the pods were full of viable seeds. It seems that only 1 out of every 3 or 4 flowers ended up producing a pod, and some of the pods only had 1 or 2 seeds. I suspect that fertility, spacing, or some other factor limits the number of seeds that any one plant can produce, even if there is full pollination, and the rest of the flowers and pods are simply aborted. I let the pods fully dry for a few weeks at the end of the polytunnel, laid out on a sheet of woven plastic or tarp. Once I felt they were really dry, I walked on the pile with clean boots to crush the pods and dislodge the seeds. By shaking the tarp, I could encourage the seeds to work their way to the bottom of the pile and allow the lighter, empty pod shells to come to the surface. It took a few passes to break open all the pods, but eventually I was able to remove most of the empty shells, and I took the seeds and remaining debris and chaff outside to winnow in the wind. Once all the chaff had blown away and I removed many of the rotten and blemished seeds, I ended up with just over 5 kilograms of mostly dried seeds. This seems like a lot, but I really didn't know what to expect or how it would compare to the same plants growing outside. Looking at some numbers again for those who might be interested, I calculated that there was about 3,200 seeds in total. This works out to about 85 seeds saved for every seed that I planted, or a bit less if I include the seeds that didn't germinate and were discarded. But that is still a good return on investment. Looking at it as a crop of dried seeds for eating, this works out at about 135 grams of dried seeds per plant, or I got about 1.3 kilograms of dried seed in each square meter of growing space. But I'm not sure if this is a very useful number, as the plants grew really tall and overshadowed the adjacent beds, and I would expect a lower yield if the area was scaled up or if I was growing the same plants outside. It was great to be able to produce such a large quantity of broad bean seeds with very few damaged or rotten seeds. But it does take up a lot of polytunnel space that is probably better used for more abundant and valuable crops. If I was to do it again, I would sow the seeds even earlier in the previous year, right after the main crop was removed in the autumn. And I'd probably give more space to each plant so that they were not so crowded, and I would definitely pinch off the tops of all the plants to keep them short enough to not need support. All of this would likely produce an earlier crop of dried seeds, and I'd prefer to remove the whole plant for drying and threshing later. And this would hopefully reduce the amount of effort, even if the yield is a bit lower. And if the broadbean plants were finished earlier, it would give me a chance to get another crop into the same bed while there was still some warmth in the summer. Even with the extra effort and hassle this year, I ended up saving lots of seeds for use in the gardens. I plan to store enough seeds for quite a few years of growing this variety, probably in the freezer to maintain their viability, and also to set aside plenty to share with other growers. After that, I'll probably still have 3 to 4 kilograms of broadbean seeds for eating, and I'm still exploring different ways of eating them, as the skin is quite tough. My current favorite method is to soak the seeds and then to let them sprout for a few days, then cook them, remove the outer shell, and then puree the inner seed as part of a dip or spread. This is all part of the process of exploring different ways of growing and eating dried bean or pea seeds in Ireland. Next year, I want to grow a long row of broad beans outside to see what kind of yield of dried seeds I could get without putting in much effort. And it would be good to explore growing dried pea seeds as another option, especially if I can find a way of growing them without having to put up a structure for them to climb. This year, I have been trialing growing runner beans outside solely for dried seeds, which might be a reliable option in Ireland. The seeds of this species of bean are large and the skin is quite soft, and it will produce outside, though these plants need better weather than broad beans and a structure to grow up. I also have some runner bean varieties growing in one of my polytunnels, with a range of other varieties of climbing and bush beans that I'm leaving to produce dried seeds for seed saving and to explore eating. This is a fairly extravagant use of a valuable polytunnel space simply to produce dried seed like this. I was really needing to reduce my workload this past summer, and I thought it would be interesting to occupy part of one of my polytunnels with a trial of beans like this that I could simply let grow for the busier months. In many ways, I still think it would be better to buy in storable beans like this that are grown somewhere else that has a much more suitable climate for this type of crop. And then to use the polytunnel and even our growing space outside to produce more abundant quantities of higher valuable vegetable crops that are harder to get around here. Or at least to use the space to produce crops that are much better tasting and fresher. But I am glad to be able to have the chance to explore different ways of growing a storable vegetable protein in the temperate and damp climate that we have here in Ireland, as I think it could be a useful and interesting thing to be able to do.